We are here talking with you today about root causes of autoimmunity. There's a lot to cover today, but before we get started, for those of you who don't know who we are, we'll just quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Jessica Melnick. I'm a registered holistic nutritionist, the founder of the Anti-Arthritis Method, the host of the Happy Joints Arthritis Solutions Group, and I help both women and men with various forms of arthritis get back to living life the way they choose to, not the way that they have to. And if you can probably tell by the way I'm dressed today, it is quite chilly here in Saskatchewan. Tons of snow we've had over the last couple of days. So just adjusting to about 10 degrees colder than we have been having lately. I'll hand it over to you, Casey.
Well, it's beautiful here, so I'll just leave that right where it is.
Of course it is.
I am Casey Kephart. I'm the founder of the Feel Good Formula. I am a functional medicine nutritionist and work with women with all different types of autoimmune diseases to get you back to the activities you love to do, trash those symptoms, get your life back, basically. I'm super excited to talk about today's topic just because I don't think a lot of these points are very well known for what causes an autoimmune disease. And we mainly think it's simply just genetics, and that is simply just not true whatsoever. So let's dive into that.
Absolutely. So as we know, these conditions don't just come out of nowhere. When we have arthritis or an autoimmune condition, this is something that is developing over long periods of time, but often, and I know at least in my case, I'm not sure about you, Casey, but my symptoms kind of came out of the blue. It was like I woke up one morning and I was injured, but I hadn't hurt myself. So it was really strange. Sometimes things happen, I think, a lot more gradually than that. But the problem itself develops over a long period of time. So we often have a trigger that creates the onset of our illness. And that's where we start having all of our symptoms. So I know for me, if I was to guess kind of what the perfect storm for me to develop my symptoms and the onset of my illness was a huge amount of stress after an acute stressful event. But also I had been experiencing chronic stress for years up until that point. And I think it just got to the point where my body, it just couldn't do it anymore. So I don't know about you, Casey. Can you relate to any of that?
Yeah, definitely. My symptoms, I mean, it felt like it was out of nowhere, but I wasn't very mindful of my body back then because I didn't know I had to be. But it started with the severe stomach aches, not knowing that I was going to be diagnosed with celiac. And mine was the root cause of mine, looking back, was probably stress and toxin overload just from living in a moldy and feces-ridden house back in the day.
Yeah, so it can be a number of factors, and we're going to talk about that today. So we're going to go first talk a little bit about having a genetic predisposition and also our environment. So obviously we don't have control necessarily over our genetic hand that we've been dealt. But we do have more control over our environment to some extent and how we live our lives and our lifestyle that can really impact whether or not we develop those illnesses that we may have a predisposition for. Mm-hmm. So like I said, our genetic predisposition is just our inherited DNA, and we can actually turn aspects of our genes on or off. Now, Casey, do you want to talk a tad bit about that? I know this is kind of your wheelhouse, so I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, a perfect analogy would be, I hear a lot like my mom or my dad has diabetes, so I'm just bound to get diabetes. No, that is not true. Our environment and everything we're going to go through today turns on or off those genes. So quite literally, if you have the gene for diabetes, we can turn that on and we can turn that off. What you do in your environment will turn that on and off, just like a light switch. So just because your mom or dad has diabetes absolutely does not mean that you are going to. And it's the same with an autoimmune disease, or the severity, at least, of an autoimmune disease. You are in total control of of what happens. I wouldn't say total. I would say you are 95% in control on what happens and how severe it is.
Yeah. So With that being said, let's go into some of the environmental and lifestyle aspects that we have more control over. And one of the first ones we're going to talk about is our psychosocial input. So these are things like our positive and negative views and our experiences. So our life experiences, our relationships, spirituality, all those kinds of things. So for example, toxic relationships, having negative thought patterns, living in a toxic environment, like having an unstable home, issues at school when we're younger, or when we're older, issues at work, and how we feel about these experiences and how that impacts us. So these are all huge, huge factors that can lead up to autoimmune illnesses coming to light later on. Did you want to add anything to that, Casey?
Yeah, this bucket is basically our mental health, right? And our values and how we view the world. So we've had other lives and other guest speakers on here that have talked about internalizing all of this trauma and negative thoughts that we have, and how that can increase in inflammation and symptoms in general. So what you think, how you feel, and how you act directly correlates with the severity and if you are going to get a chronic illness now or later on in life.
Yeah. And one of the really interesting things that Casey and I have been talking a bit about lately, because we've seen Dr. Gabor Mate, he's been kind of on the different podcast circuits that we listen to. He is a physician out of Canada, and he's written several books. And he's recently come out with one called The Myth of Normal. And on these podcast talks, he talks about how rheumatoid arthritis is kind of a manifestation of like people pleasing and just like not taking care of ourselves, putting everybody else first. And I know that so many people in my community can really relate to this. And I know I can relate to this. I call myself a recovering people pleaser. And I know Casey and I have talked about this on our lives before. And, these types of behaviors and, putting ourselves on the bottom of the priority list really adds up over time, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's not something physical that we can feel that we're doing, so we often don't think that it affects our chronic illness or chronic inflammation in general, but that's one of those subconscious things that our body is holding on to like a tight wound ball, and that just it causes inflammation in our body. So we need to let go, release. We need to do maybe some therapy or meditation or whatever your modality is for releasing what's going on. Is going to be important for healing an autoimmune disease, also not getting an autoimmune disease, and just being a lighter, more positive human being in general, where you're going to like your life 100% more. There's so many benefits to it.
Absolutely. So another environmental input is physical exercise and movement. Are you getting any exercise or enough? Are you sedentary, or are you even working out too much? Because that can also be a factor. Are you working out too intensely? So too little is damaging, too much is damaging. And for those of you who have an autoimmune condition, there is, when it comes to exercise, you really have to find the sweet spot and the balance that works for you. So when you have an autoimmune condition, fatigue is one of the cornerstones of the symptoms. And so taking a workout that's too long or too hard can make you just feel much more tired and can actually exacerbate your symptoms. So it's finding, okay, the movement that feels good for you, that's also the right endurance and intensity for what your body can handle. I know for myself, I was all gung-ho. I remember it was right before COVID hit. I wanted to learn how to lift heavier weights because I've always exercised. It's really important in terms of my stress management. And I thought, oh, I'm going to try something new. And so I hired a personal trainer to make a couple workouts for me and walk me through how to do the movements properly. And the workouts themselves were about 45 minutes or so. And Oh my goodness. I was so tired after these workouts. I felt like I needed to sleep the whole day. Like I literally couldn't think. I was just exhausted. Like I just wanted to have a nap. And I thought, oh, it's just, I'm just getting used to this. And there is some truth to that because sometimes it takes some adjustment to get used to some new exercise, but it didn't go away. And it was months. And I just decided, no, I have to stick to my 20 to 30-minute exercise routines at home that are less intense. And that makes me feel so much better. So instead of making me feel like I need to sleep the rest of the day, it actually energizes me and makes me feel better. But it was something that I had to really recognize that it just wasn't a good fit for me.
Yeah. Jessica, I want to add something to that, in that on top of fatigue, it also causes a leaky gut if you exercise too much. It is exercise in general is stress to the body. It can be a good stress or it can be a bad stress. And when we have the bad stress forms when it's too much for your chronic illness of a body to handle. So when that happens, that stress and that cortisol level starts to poke holes in that gut lining, like we've talked about before, and it makes that leaky gut more permeable and more chance of bacteria and undigested food particles to go into your bloodstream to make you feel worse. And here's the symptoms, here's the fatigue. So we really, really, really need to find that healthy balance. And like Jessica said, she felt fatigued. So that was one of her symptoms. She knew that she was doing too much for her body. Mine is I get an autoimmune flare. So I was doing CrossFit, and even running a certain amount of miles does make me have an autoimmune flare. So I get irritable. My bowels are awful. My gut is awful in terms of just pains and bloating. And of course, my energy. So these are things to just be aware of when you are exercising. We're not telling you to not move. You need to move, but we need to find that balance, because being sedentary is also not good for pains, leaky gut, stress management, mental health, anything, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for that. That it's such an important point. One other big thing, I know Casey and I bring this up from time to time on our lives because we are holistic practitioners, and this is something that's part of the whole picture. So it's not just the body, it's our mind and it's trauma. So trauma is deeply disturbing or distressing experiences. It can be what we call big T or little t experiences. So not necessarily something horrific like being sexually assaulted, which would be considered like a big T, but it can be smaller things. It can be more subtle. So things like dating a narcissistic person, being mentally or emotionally manipulated in a relationship of any sort, maybe getting a concussion, something as extreme as being in a war-torn country, having abandonment issues. We also talk about ACEs. So refresh my memory on this acronym, Casey. It's basically an assessment of, adverse childhood experiences. Yes. So what studies have found is that if we can look back on various adverse childhood experiences, there is a connection between those and developing illness later in life. Things like seeing a loved one die, having your pet dying. So there's so many different experiences that we can have that can result in trauma for us. And the same experience happening to two different people can look really, really different and can affect those two people differently depending on the other factors that we talked about. So my partner, for example, he can handle certain things so much better than I can. And I think that's why we mesh so well together, because he can really support me for things that I don't do so well at, and we can complement each other that way. But trauma in itself, big T or little t, can be, having a friend say something mean to you when you were little and it really stuck with you throughout a lifetime. Mm-hmm. So these things that are still hurting you today that you maybe have not released or have not worked through, those are still harming you physically, whether you know it or not.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The subconscious mind holds on to a lot that we don't really know of, and that's where hypnosis can be really beneficial, or tapping into that meditation state if you can get into that restful zone after practicing it. Can be really important in healing and just forgiving. There's so many books and podcasts and YouTube videos on how to forgive, what that actually means to forgive, instead of just saying, I forgive you. Forgiveness is actually this like body sensation act that we do to let go of that trauma or situation in general.
Yeah, so it's not letting the other person off the hook, which I think is why some people are reluctant to forgive, because they think it's, forgiving is letting people off the hook and saying it's okay, you did what you did. That's not the case. It's choosing to not let that person's actions hurt you anymore, beyond the fact, like the experience itself. That's at least the way that I look at it.
Yeah, definitely.
So another big one, of course, in terms of our environmental inputs is our diet, our nutrition, our air, our water. So the things that we are intaking into our body, either on purpose or involuntarily. So obviously we don't have much control over the pollution around us. So let's talk about things though that we can control. So the type of food that we're eating. Are we eating processed foods, fried foods, the standard American diet? Excess sugar and additives and preservatives. Are we having excess alcohol? Man-made foods, for example. So that's just an extension of processed foods. So some of the interesting meat substitutes out there, those I would call man-made foods. Please read the ingredients, and if you don't know what the heck it is, it's likely something you should not put into your body. Having a lot of refined carbohydrates, that's actually really, really hard, not only on your blood sugar, especially if you are diabetes does run in your family, but it's also can lead to higher cholesterol as well, and obesity, all sorts of issues that come out of that. Chemicals in our food. So that's mostly, I'd say, with processed food and or non-organic produce. So foods that are highly sprayed. Are we eating fruits and vegetables that are genetically modified? If they are genetically modified, they're likely very highly sprayed with toxic chemicals. Tap water versus filtered water. Depending on where you live in the world, the tap water quality can really, really vary. Some of the stuff that is in tap water is quite scary. A lot of us are not aware of all those things. As I mentioned before, things like air pollution, and again, farm chemicals, being exposed to all sorts of chemicals. If you maybe you live on the prairies or you live on a farm or you're surrounded by huge amounts of cropland that is being sprayed because it's not organic. Those are some examples of some of the different things and the different toxins that we can ingest voluntarily or involuntarily. Anything you wanted to add to that, Casey?
No, I think I covered it. That was just a high level overview, and we've done more specific lives on probably each and every one of these too.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about the next one, Casey? I think it's our last one.
Yeah, the last bucket would be xenobiotics, microorganisms, and radiation. So these are mainly things we don't think about either, just like our mental health and giving us an autoimmune disease. But xenobiotics are foreign substances like pesticides, certain flavors, herbicides, fungicides, colors, drugs, things like that our bodies don't recognize as food. It is something foreign to our body. And other things that would affect our bodies in general that are in this bucket would be cosmetics like makeup, shampoo, conditioner, things that we put on our body that are, again, man-made in a chemical that is not meant to be processed and filtered in our bodies. Industrial chemicals, environmental pollutants that we like to put in the air, all the smoke that may come out of the factories or the car exhaust. That just reminds me, whenever a car goes past when I'm walking, I literally hold my breath. So I do not have to, so I don't have to breathe that in as much as possible, at least. We can only control so many things, but you can control where you live and the type of environment that you live in, like a city versus farmland, city versus suburbs, or factory land versus, regular school, public, whatever. We can really dictate where we live. And if you live by power lines, that's something else that is in the radiation bucket that's going to increase your autoimmune chances. And then you have bacteria and fungus and viruses and radiation. We often think of radiation in like chemo or having breast cancer, but radiation is also living by power lines. It's also standing right next to a microwave. It's also going to the dentist and getting x-rays. Like these normal things that we do, we're getting some sort of radiation in there. And I know there's multiple levels of it. Even your 5G on your phone is radiation. We put it in our pocket. That's going to affect our body and our muscle mass. Living by power plants. And again, with the EMFs, this is your phones, your computers, your 5G, your electrical cords, your Wi-Fi, your Bluetooth. All of these are magnetic or electrical currents that are going out that our body has to know how to process and deal with. And if you believe in evolution or mammalian times, we are not set up for that. Our bodies don't know how to handle this. And this toxin load, if you want to call it, just keeps increasing. And we're going to hit a max. We're going to hit that threshold. And that's when the autoimmune disease starts. So, or the flare up or the symptoms. So we want to be careful to watch these things and only put in natural ingredients as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know this sounds kind of scary and doom and gloom. It's not to scare you. It is just to make you aware. And I will be back on Thursday and I will be talking about some of the things that you can do about this. So there is always lots you can do and lots of things that are encouraging. And we're going to talk about those. So don't let this freak you out too much.
Overexposure is the bad thing. Moderation, balance, all of the things.
Yes.
All right. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, take care.